Click and click. Hello, welcome to this afternoon's Planning and Leading Complex Change webinar. My name is McCarron, and I'll be taking you through that in a moment, who I am and what we're going to be doing today. The first thing I see on the control screen here, there's about 100 people, over 100 people here. One thing we'd like, if you click on where it says attendees, you'll see that there is a provision of putting your hand up. It's the last of the column. There's a little hand sign. Can you just say if you can hear us and you can see us and everything's okay? If you have any problems, there's also a questions button there you can press, and if you press that questions button, what you'll find is one of my colleagues who is assisting us doing the administration will be able to help you if you've got any easy technical problems that we can sort out from our end. That's to say, if there's really complicated technical problems, it's your problem. So we're doing that, and it looks like quite a lot of people. If I scroll down now, quite a lot of people putting their hand up. I can name names of people who are not putting a hand up if you don't put your hand up. Oh yes, splendid. So everyone's putting their hand up, and we're all set to go then. So then, welcome to, as I say, the seminar that we're going to do, a webinar. I'm going to be talking to you today about planning and leading complex change, a particular way to do it. And this way is a highly visual approach to doing it. And we're also going to be picking up a couple of things about changing culture, changing people. A couple of ideas about that in the 3/4 of an hour we've got available to us this morning, or this afternoon rather, so over lunch. So if I just go through and move through and start our slide program, you can see that there you are, that's who I am. The particular things that I've put down there just to give you a flavour of where we're coming from here is the bit where it talks about focus there. The three areas I particularly spend a lot of time, my time working with organisations on. It talks about leadership and influencing, and one of the things I do with colleagues is I run the SIPFA Director of Finance's CFO Leadership Academy, and been doing that for the last, I think we've been up for about 7 or 8 years now, and we run that. The other area I spend a lot of time in is project and program management, and that includes, for instance, looking at business cases, includes the development of program plans, benefits management, those sorts of things, around about the change area, so interfaces with the leadership. And indeed, one of the things it mentions on that slide is I run with a colleague the CSL's Senior Responsible Owner Workshop. CSL is Civil Service Learning. The third area that I'm interested in, and it fits into what we're talking about today, is improvement and measurement. So that's improvement and outcome measurement. So how do you really know that you are accruing the benefits of change, that it was worthwhile, that your spending objectives were aligned, and that you're actually making an impact in areas that matter to people. So those are the sort of three areas I'm in. Now I want to get a feel for you, who's out there. I can see names, but I can't see anything other than that. So if I can now sort of point you towards the questions, and you'll see I'm going to ask you a poll, or rather not the questions, the polls. First of all, the obvious question I'm going to ask is, are you involved in change? So if you could just give me a flavour of if you are, yes. If you're not, no. There we are. Just confirming you're all involved in change. At the moment, this is sort of actively involved in change, actively involved in a change program in some capacity. And it says 80-20 there. There's a good sort of ratio, isn't it? 80-20. So what do we say to the people who put themselves down as a 20? Are they not involved in change? That's an interesting thought, isn't it? So that's the first of those questions I want to ask. The second question is, and this probably only goes to the 80% of the people there, I'm going to ask a question here, what capacity you're involved in. And the first capacity talks about you're on an SMT or you're involved as an SRO in change. The second one is you're in management of that change, and the third one there talks about, well, pretty much you're sort of either part of the implementation team or maybe just on the receiving end of change. And again, I'm seeing that about 60-odd% of people there are sort of in a change, part of a change or implementation group, and about 20% seem to be program or project managers, and about 16% are coming up, are sitting on an SMT or acting in an SRO role. So it gives me a good flavour of what we're looking for here in our poll. Okay, so I'm going to share that with you so you can see the results of that. By pressing this button, and you should be able to see, because I've just put share, you should be able to see the results of that, but take it from me, it's about 15%, 20%, and 66%. So we get a flavour of who's here. So I'm going to close that now, and what we're going to do is we're going to also, because I'm sure you've pretty much got the full view of myself, we're going to turn off the camera, and what the reason for doing that, we'll pick up the camera at the end, but the reason for doing that is because of bandwidth considerations. It just makes everything a lot faster and a lot easier to do. So I'm going to turn that off now. So don't be daunted if the camera goes. So there we are, the camera's gone, but don't worry, we're still in touch. And if there are any questions, please ask them as we go along, and we'll pick things up. You can see the stated objectives there, the planning and leading change objectives for this tour. It talks about giving a taste of a highly visual approach to planning complex change, and this is trying to reduce some of the complexity simply by understanding, simply by making connections. And I'm going to show you something I use extensively with clients that's very successful to try and understand what's going on in a change planning process. It's also, and it's not up there as a specific objective, but this is a really useful approach where you've got a program or a project that's bogged down, it's got stuck. And what you need to do is bring people back together and try and focus on what you're trying to achieve and what stage you are in change. And the second bullet point there talks about highlighting practical ways of thinking about culture and personal change. So we'll touch on that, and I'll give you a model for that I use a lot to talk about culture that helps to try and understand the scale and the nature of the changes that you normally have to do in public sector organisations. So moving on now to what the main part of what we want to talk about. The main part is about thinking about the future. It's changing for the future. And we know that the future is going to be, as it says, bigger, bolder. There's going to be less predictability about. You may have heard, I'm sure quite a few of you have heard of this phrase, black swan. Indeed, it was a popular book about it not so long ago. And a black swan is simply one of those things which nobody would believe that such a thing as a black swan existed until you discover Australia, and suddenly black swans are everywhere. As soon as you discover a black swan, you immediately say, well, of course they must have existed. And you kind of reason yourself into believing that even before you discovered a black swan, that you were aware that they were there. But the whole point about black swans and why the metaphor is used is because these things are utterly unexpected. They're almost impossible. They're not just less predictable, almost impossible to predict. For instance, one of the examples perhaps of that is the logo on the right there. There's Volkswagen. Who would have thought that an organisation like that would have been caught up in such a massive fraud, essentially? And that was a kind of black swan event. Now, as soon as it happens, everyone says, well, of course they would have done it. And indeed, I'm sure that all the other car companies, people say, are just playing just as fast and loose with the truth. But actually, beforehand, no one knew it was coming. There's also, as it says, bigger solutions, bigger complexities, bigger opportunities, of course. And actually today, if those of you have been had your ear to the news this morning, will have heard that the Major Projects Authority and the Infrastructure Projects Group in the Treasury have been merged, and from January it's going to be the Infrastructure and Projects Authority. And that's going to take over large Tier 1 projects across government. And this is because the complexity of things like Crossrail, of HS2, and some of the other things that are coming up on the horizon require bigger organisations, require better thinking about governance. And quite a lot of us are affected by that further down the pecking order, further down the size of the organisations that we deal with. The speed of change is rapidly, is getting more and more rapid each day. The change in what people demand, the change in what the supply side can produce is changing. We in the public sector have to be very careful of that. And one of the things that many of you who see me talk in courses or talk at public events or in consultancy, and one of the things I talk about is the half-life of your services. Now just think about that for a moment, is that for a service, take any particular service or range of services, how long before half of them are pretty much redundant? How long before half of them need a substantial degree of change? Some of you might be sitting there thinking, well, maybe 18 months, maybe 2 years. I'd say if you're thinking about that, you're probably in the right ballpark. So that means about half of the services you're running, you're responsible for today, will need substantive change within 2 years. Now just think about the implications of that. The implications are that you have to constantly be looking and selecting and being ready for those changes. Another implication, though, is much more profound. It's why on earth are you setting up permanent structures, permanent systems to deliver services when actually many of the services that they're delivering have only got a half-life of 2 years? Just a thought. The final bullet point there that's forcing us to think about these changes is there's more informed and active customer and stakeholder interactions. People are much more likely to be publicly demanding different services. They're much more likely to be comparing us with the private sector than they ever were. And indeed, they are much more likely to be wanting to be part of the production, part of the co-produced service. All of these add to the kind of complexity that we're seeing in public sector services. Which means actually what we're dealing with is complexity. Now, I think the easiest way to try and get a handle on this is to say that you've got type 1 and type 2 problems you're trying to tackle. The type 1 problems are the existing situations where the existing and desired states are clear. You've got agreed upon solution pathway. It's a relatively low risk solution, and a final solution of the situation, final resolution of the problem is possible, and you can plan for that. And these are the things that you use Prince2 for, classically, or any of these other project management methodologies. Maybe some of these projects will be you'll be using management of successful programs, MSP, for. Turn to the right, though. On the right-hand side, we've got the situation where you've got the existing problems are not clear, where the situation is the desired state even isn't clear. That's to say, stakeholders don't agree on where they want to go. Stakeholders don't agree on where they are at the moment. And of course, what we've got here is a high-risk situation where there probably isn't one answer, and it probably isn't any answer. All you're doing is moving the situation on. And here you can't really plan for it. You need to kind of sense ahead. You need to take smaller steps, perhaps. You need to take pilots. You need to be more radical and more innovative, to use the phrase. Now, the point about this is if we turn to the lozenge on your screen at the bottom there, is that all problems have a mix of type 1 and type 2 problem situations in them. And that means what you need to be is very clever about thinking about where does my problem lie on this continuum. Is my problem like the problem illustrated on the screen there? Is it a one problem where most of it is a type 1 situation where I can manage out of it? I can use sensibly experiences I've had in the past. I can repeat systems. I can just take things that I've done before. Or maybe it's more of the type, or the second example there, where you've got a preponderance of type 2 situations. In this case, trying to solve the problem by applying a project management methodology is not going to be terribly helpful, because it's much more about a political situation where program management at the very least is likely to be required in order to understand all the different points of view. So one of the cardinal sins of change is to misunderstand what kind of change you're facing. If you've got the change towards the red end of the lozenge there, the red end of the continuum, you need to be thinking about the stakeholder engagement. You need to be thinking, I'm not going to solve this problem for everybody. Some people are going to be upset by this. Some people are going to be put out. How do I manage that situation? And I think most of what I'm going to be talking about today is aimed at that second example. Just as an aside, if you think about the time you spend on things, this particular slide, for instance, I developed for a public seminar which was to the project management and operations delivery profession in government a few months ago, and we were calculating how many hours civil servants spent on in a year on these things. A senior civil servant might actually spend about 2,000 hours on fairly straightforward, repeatable problems, but only 200 hours on being an SRO of a program. So it's just a thought that only 1/10 of the time might be spent actually doing the stuff that actually requires senior input and senior understanding and insight. So where does that bring us into thinking about change and starting to deal with it? Well, if we've got these two types of organizations, what we need is probably two types of structures to deal with them. On the left, you've got a structure there, which is like a jet airliner. This is the metaphor I always use. And you'll see that the wings of the jet airliner there point upwards. Now, those wings pointing upwards are technically called a dihedral. And what that means is that it gives that airframe incredible stability moving in a straight line. Physically, the law of physics mean that if it tries to turn, the air pressure on the dihedral pushes it much more on the side it's turning, and it forces it back onto the straight and narrow. And the result is these airframes are fantastic for taking us on our holidays from A to B. They're great for going in straight lines. They are piloted by people, men and women who are trained to be very cool, sitting at the front there telling us to put on our life jackets, how to put on our life jackets, telling us don't worry, it's going to be safe, sit back and buy from the trolley as it goes down the aircraft. They have huge, great control surfaces on those wings. They have a radar system which looks ahead of them to make sure there's no mountains that they're going to fly into. So everything is designed for the smoothest of operations. In fact, everything is designed for type 2 problems. You know where you're going, you know the route to get there. Look on the right. The metaphor here is a fighter aircraft. A fighter aircraft doesn't have a dihedral to its wings, and that makes it incredibly unstable. The fighter aircraft wants to turn on its back, and that's why it's got those two strange wings on the front, those two little wings called canards. And what those two little duck wings do is they're computer controlled, and they keep the thing from turning. But what it also means is it's incredibly agile. It's capable of turning very quickly. So although it's still an aircraft, it's actually an aircraft that's designed for a specific situation, which is a type 2 problem, where you don't know where you're going, you don't know where the enemy is, you don't know who's the enemy, you don't know where a missile might attack you, you don't know whether or not you need to attack. So the pilots are going to be trained differently. The infrastructure that supports those pilots are going to be different. The control surfaces have to be very sensitive to enable it to flip from left to right, to barrel roll and do whatever else it needs to do. Many organizations, when they face change and say to themselves, we've got a problem, we need to be more agile, instead of creating the equivalent of a fighter aircraft, I'd suggest that what they do is they tend to create a miniature version of the original airliner. So it still changes very slowly. It's still staffed by the same type of people, with the same type of training and support, the same type of intelligence systems, the same type of radar or sensing mechanisms. And we need to be much cuter about thinking we need to be like an agile fighter plane which doesn't expect to go in a straight line. It expects change. It expects to be in a hostile environment. So with that in mind, let's look at a way of visualizing thinking, visualizing a change process. And it starts with this picture of the future. The future, of course, is a question mark. We don't know what the future is going to be like. As a result of some kind of analysis of that future, we set ourselves some targets. You can see the targets are not necessarily bullseye targets, because at this stage, and indeed any stage in strategic change, you're not quite sure where you're going. You know vaguely what the target's going to be, what their spending objectives are going to be, and you craft them perhaps to get through Treasury checks, but still they're not necessarily going to be the final targets. From those targets, though, you need to be thinking about the human element. You need to be thinking about the vision. Just telling people what the target is for cost reduction or service improvement perhaps is not really going to inspire them. There needs to be some vision there that actually sets out where you're going. The vision then needs to be supported by some kind of plans, and at the top of your screen there you'll see the plans of the airframe you're going to create, and there in the middle are the benefits that individual stakeholders are going to see. And there's an interaction and a connection, of course, between the plans for your aircraft or the plans for your organization and the benefits that you need to deliver, and they are connected back to the vision. We then need to compare where you need to go with where you are at the moment. So where you are at the moment is you're an airline and you want to be something different. So therefore there's a gap. You analyze that gap, and what we do when we analyze that gap is we identify the changes we need to make. So these are the changes, and I'll be talking about each of the elements as we go along. If we actually implement these changes, if we get down in the mud and the dirt of the scrum and the change, what we actually do is we deliver our target, which was this new kind of organization that delivers new kind of benefits. If it delivers those benefits, and if it fulfills the requirements that we specified it needs to fulfill, it will, by definition, fulfill the vision. If it fulfills the vision, it will achieve the targets. And if it achieves the targets, it will address the problems that we identified in the first place when we set out our program for change. So I'm going to take you through each of those elements. Starting with the pressures for change. Now, your analysis, different kind of organizations have different kind of ways. Maybe you are starting out with some kind of strategic plan. Maybe each change comes to you as a delightful shock. So actually you sit down and you suddenly have to do something. Maybe you've got a business case that you're developing. Whatever it is, it's a great deal of uncertainty is going to be around. And from that uncertainty, you create an analysis. You work out what you need to do. Maybe it's the financial settlement that's actually causing you to move forward. So that's the first point. You need to identify what those pressures for change are that are going to have to be responded to or going to have to be exploited as opportunities. Then you set the objectives. The objectives, they're the overall purposes or the spending objectives for your change. Now, following even Treasury guidance suggests customer focus, customer outcome focus. And it's true, we need to make sure that our spending objectives, well, our objectives for change are always focused on the customer. Who is going to be the customer of this change? Who's going to feel the benefits? We need to make sure they're distinguishable from the means of provision. So we're not presupposing this early stage what our strategy is going to be for actually achieving those objectives. And they should be fairly specific and fairly measurable. The danger is on the right-hand side. If you've got things that are very easy to identify, if your objectives come to you immediately, it's probably what you're dealing with is a situation which is fairly clear, where people are in total agreement. And that's much more likely to be a type 1 problem. And you need to go back perhaps and ask yourself, have I missed something? Because if you're embarking on a huge significant amount of change and it's only a type 1 type of problem that you're dealing with, it doesn't sound right to me. Very often, actually, what you need to do, as I say, is go back and look and think some of these objectives may not be relevant. Some of these objectives need adjusting because, in fact, at this stage of the game, I probably don't know what the problems are, and I probably don't know what other people's worldviews and other people's perception of the problems are. And some of those people I need to help me affect the change, so I'm going to have to do some work on that. The vision. Well, the vision is fairly straightforward in a way. It's actually a set of statements about what the organization is going to be like in future, but it's written as if it's already happened. Now, this is an interesting psychological trick, and it might sound very trite. It might sound very trivial to write it like this, but it's actually an important discipline simply because of the way our brains work. I don't know if any of you have read a book called Thinking Fast and Slow by the Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman. I'll repeat that, Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, because that's been in the bestseller lists and hardback books in the UK for 2 years. And it's a very interesting book that talks about the way in which the mind is much better at thinking about things in the future as if they've already happened. And that sounds a bit odd, but that's precisely what we're talking about, a vision. And it makes us inspired. It gives us a feeling that that's somewhere we want to go. So present tense words, a picture of where we want to go. It's got to be easy to grasp, and it's got to give people a sense of direction. And it's a really important document. It's a really important set of words to pin down and to constantly repeat and get everybody bought into. On the left-hand side, just at the bottom there, there's a point that I've added there. You should also describe what your culture is going to be like in the new organization. Not the whole culture, but just some words that describe some snapshots about the culture, just to flag up very early on in the process of where you expect to end up, what your culture is going to be like when you've completed your change. Once you've got a vision, you can start thinking then about stakeholders, and you can start thinking about benefits. These benefits are the things directly related to the outcome objectives, to the spending objectives. They're the measurable impacts on specific stakeholders. They're the things that people see and feel. These are the things that make the change real for people. And generally, they should be positive, because otherwise they're not going to be inspiring. So you can have planned for positive benefits. But sometimes, of course, they won't be positive. If you're going to advantage one group of people, you may disadvantage other groups of people, even if it's only because you can't spend money and resource on that other group of people. So some people are going to see this as a disadvantage. And one of the things that we have to do in change programs is to make sure we've identified for who this is going to be a difficult and rocky road. So those are the planned for negative disbenefits. Just to complicate matters, of course, one of the things that happens is you get what are called emergent benefits, which are ones you didn't think of originally. And of course, if you get emergent benefits, you're very likely also to get emergent disbenefits, and particularly if you've got type 2 problems. And the reason for that is because you didn't understand, no one can understand what the situation is in reality until you've actually entered the situation, until you've entered the change. Now that brings us to the pivotal role that stakeholders play. A lot of stakeholder analysis and stakeholder communication and engagement work is done in change programs. But some things we're not so good at. We're sometimes not so good at communicating and engaging with our own people. So we can engage with external people when it's an external facing program or project, but internally we're not so good at engaging. We might over-engage, we might over-communicate, we might communicate the wrong things. So we see this very, very often in programs where the wrong message has been sent out early on, and as a result people have disengaged from the process. The reason for talking to these people is because stakeholders increasingly are playing an active role in the change. They're co-producing the new services that we're looking for. So they have to be engaged at an early stage. They're the people who come up with the ideas, perhaps, but they're also the people who are actually going to have to implement the ideas. So the better we can get engagement and the better we can engage with our stakeholders, the better our change is likely to be. Now, we could speak for hours and hours, and we can do a lot of work on stakeholder analysis, but one thing I would mention is that when we're doing stakeholder analysis, very often what we see people doing is that they're looking at stakeholders who are helpful, and they're ignoring the stakeholders who perhaps only see disbenefits in change, the stakeholders who are not going to change, and they don't do enough work on thinking about, well, what's their worldview, what's their perspective, and that can cause lots of problems further downstream if we haven't got that sorted out. So, from the stakeholders then, and from the vision, we also start to develop a blueprint, or better spoken about as an operating model. The reason we use the word blueprint is some of you may have done or work in organizations that use managing successful programs, and they happen to use the term blueprint in managing successful programs. But a blueprint is essentially, it could be whatever you want it to be in an organization. It could be simply a flow diagram, it could be a customer journey map, it could be an organizational chart. It could be whatever it is that helps you as an organization to describe this future organization with its capacities, with its capabilities. So what is it going to be capable of? So it's kind of design brief in one way. At the minimum, you'd normally have a strategy there, you'd have structures, you'd have some systems, and you may also describe the new culture. The useful thing about thinking about it as a blueprint is if you think about a, excuse me, an engineering blueprint. An engineering blueprint is a series of drawings which overlay one another. So at the bottom of that series of drawings, it might be the foundations of an organization, the foundations of a building. The next level might be the walls of the building. The next level might be the infrastructure, the internal setup, the electricity, the water supply, and so on. And the top level could be the roofing structure of that building. And each person is able to relate, each design authority for each of those levels of that building is able to put that together. But it takes the program manager and perhaps the SRO to understand the full implications. So to be able to say, right, the thing at the top, perhaps that purple disc at the top, that connects to the next level here, and the next level down below here, and the next level here. So the whole thing should connect together. When brought together, when built, when this plan is put into action, when this plan is put into reality, it creates the building, the organization, excuse me, the service that we're aiming at. Which is why so much time needs to be devoted to thinking about your future operating model, at least initially, to get some feel for what our target is, what we're aiming at. Once you have your future operating model, you're then into a position where you can contrast it with the current situation. So we can look at our future operating model, which is our agile airframe there, our fighter plane on the right, and compare it with our aging 747 that only flies in straight lines on the left. Now, this is useful to do it in this order because sometimes we find people doing change programs, instead of embarking on looking at the model of where they want to be first, they look at where they are. Now, not only can that get very depressing, but it can also lead you into all kinds of psychological biases, wishing to keep too much of where you are, and also on a very practical basis, it's a waste of time and effort to examine something which you're probably going to leave behind. You're not going to need all the bits that you've got at the moment. But if you know where you need to go, you can compare where you are at the moment against your target operating model. That comparison, that gap analysis, gives you the box at the bottom, which is what needs to change and what needs to transform. So, just to summarize so far, working backwards, to get to the point where we need to work out what needs to change and transform, we need to do a gap analysis. To get to the gap analysis, from the gap analysis, working backwards, that comes from understanding customers, understanding benefits. Working back from that, it comes from understanding what the vision is, what the targets are, and what the problem is that we were initially trying to address. So I see we have a question there somewhere, disengagement, and it says here, wouldn't use of present tense for vision cause confusions or even disengagement of some stakeholders? No. Try it and read the book, and at the end we'll have a chat about it, and you can tell me what your present tense vision looks like, and I'll tell you that what you've got probably is a mission statement. What needs to change and transform there? If we move forward there into what needs to change and transform, the actual change projects there, we've got up there one of the icons of propaganda there, Rosie the Riveter, a doer, a real doer, and that's what change projects are. These are creating new outputs, creating new deliverables in the forms of strategies, structures, and systems. But also, one of the things that is sometimes neglected is looking at that second bullet point there, is nurturing what you've got already. When we talk about huge change programs, actually, if you look at what changes, only a proportion of the organization generally changes. There's lots of things organizations do at the moment which are actually viable and going to be useful in the future, at the future model stage. So what you're doing, therefore, is nurturing those existing strategies and structures to ensure their continued relevance. So you don't have to create a new project to create something if you've already got it there, but what you do have to do is make sure it survives the change. It survives that transformation. And then what you need is close coordination between the change projects and the transformational implementation activities. Which brings me to a question, the final polling question I'd like to ask, which is a question I'm just going to put up now and give you a moment to think this one through, which is this simple question. Does your organization distinguish, does the language, the general language in this organization, does it distinguish between the idea of change and transformation? Do you separate the things out? Or do you use them sort of interchangeably, completely interchangeably? Right, so it's about 80-20, well, it's more than 80-20, it's 85% of you would use the terms interchangeably around. So if I just should be able to share it with you, show you what that is. Now, it's not actually necessarily a big issue to use those terms interchangeably. The issue is when it causes confusion, because in the way I would approach it is say the change is about the harder changes. It's about the projects that are delivering new structures, new systems. It's about building the blueprint, if you like. It's building the airframe. The transformation in my language is about getting people to use it. So if we just flip over from Rosie the Riveter there and start looking at the connection between Rosie the Riveter and getting down in the mud and the blood and the gore of a rugby scrum, that's my analogy for the implementation process. That's my analogy for transformation. You know what you're trying to achieve, but forces are pushing either way. You've got people wanting change, people pushing against you. You put the ball into play and you heave and you push, and sometimes the ball comes out in unexpected ways and you have to put it back in again, or the play changes. All of those confusing things that go on are things that go on in implementation. You can't necessarily prepare for them in the same way as you prepare for a project. But what you can do is you can prepare for them in the same way as a rugby team prepares for them. It practices. It imagines standing there. It imagines being in that kind of scrum, and if the ball comes out this way, where does the ball go? Which of the backs pick it up? Who kicks it? Do we go for a penalty? All those things can be practiced beforehand, but actually on the day, in those 80 minutes, you don't know where the ball's going to go. You hope, though, that you're coordinated enough to pick up the balls and run with them in the right direction. Sometimes you'll score, sometimes you won't. Extending the analogy a little too far, the balls are really the products of projects, and that's why you need to connect with them all the time and go back to the project deliverers and say, look, this ball you've sent me, it's not quite the right shape, can you pump it up, can you do something with it? The other point about what's going on here is that it's not an event, it's more of a journey. And one of the pictures that I often use is someone learning to ride a bicycle. And you've got someone there learning to ride a bicycle. And if I just give you a sort of mental image for a moment, if those friends there teaching that girl to ride a bicycle, if those 4 people let go of the bicycle, and that's the first time she's been on a bicycle, we all know what's going to happen. She's going to fall off. There's no doubt about it. You cannot get on a bicycle for the first time and just cycle off. It's very, very difficult to do. We know this. And anyone who's taught their children to cycle will know exactly this. What you need to do is to support that person through that change process. If that was one of your children on that bicycle and that was one of you holding that child up, if you let go and that child fell, you kiss their knees better, you would assure it, you reassure it, you put it back on the bicycle and you give it another go, you'd hold the handlebars or the seat until they got the idea of it, and they'd be a bit wobbly to start with, and over a few days they'd get it, a few hours, and then they'd be cycling off into the distance and you'd be very proud of yourself and your child. At work, when people get on the bicycle of change and they fall off it because they've never done it before, what do? Some people give them a good kicking for not knowing how to ride a bicycle. And that's one of the problems we have, is that people don't appreciate the effort that goes into change, because changing working practices is not as visible as learning to ride a bicycle. Changing the way in which you interact with colleagues, perhaps becoming a business partner, is a new thing. No one's tried it before. And you're going to be shaky, you're going to need support, and we need to plan for all that support. So implementation is a very messy process, and all we can do is we can practice beforehand, we can predict what we're going to do, we can get into the right teams, we can have the forwards and the backs practicing together, we can start to do things in pilots, we can try it out on the practice field before we actually have to do it for real. And sometimes we have to go back to the drawing board and start again. If we've done it right so far, what we should have got to is the finished product. The finished product is this new agile organization, a transformed organization capable of delivering the required benefits, which will be one with the right strategy, structure, systems, and the right culture. It'll be one that has the capacity and the capabilities that you wanted at the beginning. Or actually, probably it won't quite be quite what you thought you were going to get. In fact, here I'm saying you start off with an airliner, you end up with a jet. Maybe what we end up with is a 747 with smaller wings, a little bit more instability, and maybe have a fighter pilot flying it. That could lead to problems, but at least it's a halfway house. But what we should end up with for the 21st century and for the changes we're facing is an organization flexible enough to complete the mission, even in the face of that type 2 uncertainty, because it's no good saying, well, I can predict the next 2 years ahead with some precision, so therefore I'm going to create an organization for the next 2 years ahead with some precision. If you know, in fact, that after 2 years you're going to have to reorganize, too much precision in this case can lead you into producing something which, as soon as you've created it, is obsolete. What you need is something that's capable of lasting at least for the half-life, if not 2 half-lives, of your typical process. So, in summary, we start with the problem. We set ourselves some targets, which will be fuzzy to start with and might be sharpened up. We set a vision. Right, now then, future sense or future tense against looking back tense. It was a good question in a way, because you can say to yourself, well, should I just set out for people, this is where we're going to be? But if you're doing that, then all you're doing is kind of repeating what you're going to be saying in the blueprint, because you're saying this is what we're going to be like. This is what, in the blueprint, this is what we should look like. The vision is the result of the blueprint and the benefits being achieved. Although the vision is created first or drafted first before you start looking at the benefits and start looking at the blueprint, if you think about it, it is the result. It's the end result of all those change efforts, which is why when you write about it, if you write about it in the present tense but talk about it as if it's 2 years or 18 months or 6 months from now, it actually has that, clicks that little psychological switch in your mind or in the population's mind who you're talking to, and it helps them to look ahead. It helps them to not mix up the vision and the objective with how to achieve the vision and objective, which is why it's so important. So once you've got the vision, that feeds into your blueprint, it feeds into your benefits. You need to make sure those are validated and indeed produced by stakeholders. You then look at the comparison between where you need to go and where you are, do a gap analysis. That then gets you into the transformation plan, the projects, the harder projects, and the interrelationship you've got with those transformation, those implementation activities, the rugby scrum, getting down in the dirt and the mud and the blood. That produces for you in a cyclical way, as you learn about the changes, you learn capabilities, you learn about emergent benefits, the new organization. That produces the benefits, that achieves the blueprint, that achieves the vision. That, if you've got the vision, then it must achieve and address the spending objectives. And if you've done that, then you've addressed whatever problem you had to start with. And of course, all of you would now chorus, and then you start the whole process again. How would I finish off? Clarity is good, but if it's too clear, maybe you're not trying hard enough. Maybe you're only seeing the type 1 part of the problem. Speaking about the transformed organization as if it's already exists is a really powerful mental tool. So do try it. Change is easier to plan and execute than transformation, and we normally leave that out. And that's where the learning to ride a bicycle metaphor comes in. And the final point, I'd hope that you'd understand now something about the visual approach to thinking about change, and also using those metaphors I've given you about not just about the bicycle but about the airframes to start thinking about the organizational culture that you are looking for. So team, there we are. That's completion of our the main part of the webinar today. Questions? Any questions? I'm very happy to take as many questions as come out, and I do hope you found that useful. And you will be engaging in change with renewed vigor in the coming months and weeks using this idea. So I'm just going to turn back on the questions, turn back on the screen cam so we can see where we're here, and any questions coming up. So the screen cam should be on. I can't see it, so I'm going to turn it back on again once more. There we are. Oh, no, it's got to go. So, any questions coming up? Have we got any questions on the screen side there? No, we're all happy with it. So, questions, polls, attendees out. No other questions. So, well, if there's no more questions, I think we're just overrunning slightly. So maybe that's what we're no, just overrunning slightly. So I think therefore we'll call it a day there. So thank you for listening. I hope you found that useful, and I hope that we'll see you again. And those people I've met before, I'm welcome, and good to that you join us. And as I say. Don't be strangers. We are always here to help. Okay, thank you.